today, so this is the first of 4 classes. And in the first class, we talked a lot of what Buddhism is about. Who is a Buddhist? What are the different types of Buddhism? We talked about the history of the life of Buddha Shakyamuni, the history of Buddhism, how it spread all around the world. And so today, actually, we're going to get into the real heart of Buddhism. And so basically what we're going to spend the whole session, or probably most of the session, talking about are the Four Noble Truths. And this is what everybody agrees is what Buddha's main teaching is. And everything you can actually radiate, all the other teachings you hear, all the different types of Buddhism, they all radiate from sort of the central spoke of the Four Noble Truths. So it is the core thing about Buddhism. But before getting into that, I just want to remind you a little bit. Last week, we talked about how Buddhism can be practiced at many different levels. And people all over the world do practice Buddhism at different levels. For some people, Buddhism is sort of just like a self-help shop. It has all sorts of helpful, neat hints and ideas about how to deal with problems like anger, and also how to deal with difficulties in life. And some people just sort of select out those practices that are helpful and use them. And, and that's a perfectly good thing to do, I think. Other people, Buddhism is just a very interesting philosophy. It's an interesting way of looking at the world. And they practice it and they're just study it because they're interested. And many people find Buddhism, how Buddhists look at the world, very, very fascinating. Other people practice sort of an austere Buddhism, sort of a Buddhism, which is actually pretty close to what the original Buddhism was. So it's a Buddhism that is not very religious. It does not have a lot of religious ceremony and so forth. So the Theravadan tradition or the Vipassana people are sort of the people who work at that level. And Zen is very streamlined also, and very, very elegant actually. But the type of Buddhism that our center practices is Tibetan Buddhism, which is the opposite extreme. It has the most ceremony you could imagine. Ceremony all over the place, colorful pictures of Buddhas and all sorts of different pujas and, monks chanting and all sorts of things. It's a very colorful religion. And of course, what all these different aspects of Buddhism reflect is sort of the culture that they went to. And so in Tibetan Buddhism, there was an earlier religion in Tibet called the Bon religion. And the Tibetan Buddhism sort of absorbed a lot of these different elements into Buddhism. But at any rate, what I think is the important thing, to me at least, and for, at least the way I practice Buddhism for my life, is how Buddhism helps you every day of your life. So when we get into the Four Noble Truths, we're going to look all the way at sort of the end game, things like liberation or enlightenment. But I think you shouldn't get too caught up in that, because the danger is that you can get so focused on enlightenment that you forget to use Buddhism to help you in your everyday life. And I think if you use Buddhism as an everyday practice, that'll take you all the way to enlightenment. You don't need to worry. You will always get whatever help you need to go all the way to enlightenment. But I think the most important thing of all is always to focus on how it can work in your everyday life. And so I'm going to go through the Four Noble Truths. But when I do that, I also want to keep emphasizing how they work in your daily life as well as the larger scope of things. So the Four Noble Truths are 4 things, as it says. And Buddha, when he taught, used to do this a lot because he grew up in India, which was a very oral society. And in that oral society, not much was written down. And so memory was an important thing. So Buddha was always saying, I want to tell you 4 things about this, 8 things about this, or 5 things about that, because that made it easier for people to remember. And actually, for the first 200 years that Buddhism existed, it existed as an oral culture, very much like the Veda operated in the Hindu community, and also the great Indian epics were originally oral, and then eventually all of these things got written down. So in India, people were great at memorizing long texts and so forth. But at any rate, the Four Noble Truths are four, and they all have to do with what's commonly called in the West suffering. But the notion of suffering is actually too limited. In fact, sometimes people, especially when people first learned about Buddhism, 100, 200 years ago, when especially the British went to India and they started learning about Buddhism, they would often call Buddhism the dismal science. And the reason they called it the dismal science is because all you guys talk about is suffering, suffering, suffering. It's so pessimistic, so negative. In practice, it's actually not pessimistic or negative at all. And in fact, this notion of suffering, the actual Sanskrit word for suffering is dukkha. And this word dukkha actually has a meaning. It's actually D-U-H-K-A, and there's a dot under the H, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But anyway, this meaning of dukkha includes suffering, but actually it includes a lot more than suffering. And I think the best translation that most people like for dukkha is being unsatisfactory. So being unsatisfactory. So if you're suffering, that's certainly unsatisfactory, but there's lots of other things that are unsatisfactory also, that disturb you, that we feel really are just not acceptable. And so this first of the Four Noble Truths is called the truth of suffering, and it's called or sometimes it's called true suffering, is the way they refer to it also. And there's a medical analogy that people often use when they're talking about the Four Noble Truths. And I'm going to go through that medical analogy because I think it's helpful. Because the Buddha, when he came, he was focused really on helping people. He was not focused on teaching philosophy. In fact, he often complained that philosophical views were actually an obstruction, because what happens in philosophical views is people's ego gets involved, and people like things or dislike things just depending on how their ego reacts to it. And the image that I also talked about last week was this analogy where the Buddha said, imagine you're walking in the forest and somebody shoots you with a poisoned arrow. If somebody shoots you with a poisoned arrow, you're not going to start looking at the arrow and saying, oh, what wonderful wood the arrow's made out of. I wonder if it's birch or pine. These feathers, I wonder what bird these feathers came from and so forth. No, what you're interested in doing is extracting the arrow, maybe sucking out the poison, maybe cauterizing the thing, stop the. You're interested in curing yourself. And that's what Buddha said. Buddha said, I'm here because you people are suffering and you need help. And I know how to help you. And I'm going to teach you what I know. And if you follow what I say, it will help you. And I know it will help you because I follow this path and it has worked for me. So in the medical analogy, Buddha is the doctor. So that's the beginning say. So Buddha is the one who can actually help us with our suffering, who can write us a prescription, if you like, who can, tell us how to cure our illness. And our illness is actually this first item, this dukkha, the suffering or dissatisfactory, unsatisfactory aspect of life. And as it's usually taught, there are three types of suffering that the Buddha taught. We usually call these manifest suffering, which is the first one. And this manifest suffering is the suffering of what you think is suffering. So it's real pain. So if you have an illness or a disease and your body hurts, that is what we mean by manifest suffering. It's what we really normally think of as suffering. The second suffering is the suffering of change, which I'm going to talk in a second. And the third suffering is called pervasive suffering, which is even more complicated to explain, but it is possible. And I think the second suffering, the suffering of change, is the thing where it gets more into this dukkha as being unsatisfactory. Because what the suffering of change means is it means that everything in this world constantly changes. So that's this is actually one of the four seals of Buddhism, one of the things that characterize Buddhist teachings. It's a thing that Buddha prominently taught over and over again. And I think it's probably almost one of the most important concepts in all of Buddhism. So in Buddhism, everything changes without exception. It all changes. And when you start looking, if you start exploring what the implications of that for our regular life are, you will see that because everything changes, first of all, it means we cannot be eternally happy. Because if you were eternally happy, then it wouldn't change. You would always be the same. So, and as we go along and talking, everything that I'm referring to is what we call samsara. So that's important. And what you should think, I'm going to explain samsara more, but the samsara and nirvana are two key notions. But for now, let's talk about samsara as just being the world that you know. So in this world that we know, that we're born into as humans, and that we experience, there's nothing that doesn't change. And because there's nothing that ever changes, we're never going to find heaven on earth. We're never going to have the perfect political society. Our lives are never going to be perfect. And in a sense, we sort of know that because, I explained Buddha's biography last week. And, and the thing that we talked about with Buddha's biography is his big thing is he wanted to find the solution to the problem of suffering. And he saw three direct forms of suffering. He saw the suffering of illness, he saw the suffering of old age, and he saw the suffering of death. And all of these things are pervasive in our world. And even if you can be a millionaire, you can still get cancer. You will certainly still grow old, and you are certainly going to die. And that is a form of suffering. So we know that there is suffering, and so there's never going to be a heaven on earth. Yet Buddha has a solution. He found a solution to the problem of suffering. And that's what we come to in these other three steps, these other three noble truths. So the suffering of change, though, is even a little more subtle than that. The suffering of change means that, let's say you find something really good. Let's say you have the most delicious meal that you've ever had the whole time you've been alive. It is absolutely wonderful. So you say, okay, well, that's joy, that's happiness, that's wonderful. And it is joy, and it is happiness. But embedded in that joy and happiness is suffering. And that's this dukkha. It's unsatisfactory. And the reason it's unsatisfactory is you can't hang on to it. You have it in that peak, that blissful moment. Maybe even have it for 20 minutes while you're eating it. But then as soon as the meal's over, the blissfulness starts to fade and it goes away. You can't keep that blissfulness. The ancient Romans used to do this crazy thing. They would have these amazing orgies and feasts and things, and they would actually go and force themselves to vomit so that they could continue eating. So they would empty their stomach to try to prolong this, the bliss of the great things they were eating. But even if you do that, you still can't hang on to this happiness because you get bored with everything. The one thing that's certain in life is whatever we have, once we get used to it, once it becomes familiar enough, we get bored with it. And most of the time, most of the happiness that we have, if you look at it, it's actually anticipation. I think about a child at Christmas. a child at Christmas, where they're getting all the presents over the Christmas tree, and maybe they've written off to Santa Claus, and and they're expecting all this wonderful stuff, and they're so thrilled. But as soon as they get it, as soon as they open the present, they're happy for a very short time. And then they're used to their presents, and usually they just sort of toss it aside. Same thing, imagine if you've ever bought a new car, especially if it's your very first new car, imagine how wonderful it was, how excited you are when you got that car, and how thrilled you are with everything. Sometimes when they get a new car, they will park, half a mile away from every store because they don't want anybody to bump into with the door opening to bump into it. So when you see that, but then what happens after a few years? Your car is just a car. It gets dirty. You take it to Trader Joe's and it gets scratches all over the place and gets bumped into, and then eventually it gets old and it gets filthy and it gets beat up, and then eventually it's discarded. And it's like that with everything in life. And that's the problem with life, and that's one reason why life can never be eternally happy, because things change. And if things change, it means that if you're at the peak, if you're at the summit of the absolute bliss, you can't hang on to it. And it's terrible not to hang on to it. Another example of this, and you can remember what happened in 1929 when the stock market crashed. You had people in New York City throwing themselves out of windows. That's when the buildings were small enough you could actually open the windows. They're not skyscrapers like today. People were committing suicide because they couldn't imagine not being wealthy anymore. They couldn't imagine being a poor. There's nothing so terrible as to have something absolutely wonderful and then to lose it all. To have something wonderful, lose it all, is almost more painful than never to have had it in the first place. And for that reason, we'll talk about there are other states of existence in Buddhism that we will talk about. So there are heavenly realms that we will talk about. And it's the same thing. Imagine yourself being this godlike being and having absolutely just amazing amounts of pleasure and whatever. Well, in Buddha's world, heaven doesn't last. People eventually burn up their positive karma and fall out of heaven back to maybe a human existence again, and so forth. And so it's always like that. So in samsara, which is our world, in our samsara, we will expand beyond our ordinary experience. But in the Buddhist world of samsara, into the worlds of which we are reborn, there can never be eternal happiness. There's just constant change. And so it's something worth thinking about, and it's something that sort of is, I think, very different than an American's normal way of looking at the world. We always look at the world as progress. Things are always going to get better and better. And in the Buddhist world, yes, things can get better, but you can't stay in the top of the heap. If you're the CEO of an officer, eventually you'll retire or die or lose it all. If you've got millions of dollars, you may lose it in this life, but you'll certainly lose it when you die. So that's something that's really well worth thinking about, which is, if everything changes, what does that mean? So that's the first thing. So that's the suffering of change. The suffering of change is that even at our most pleasurable moments, even that thing, even though it is pleasurable, you can't hang on to it. Okay, so then the third one, which is, I think, a little more complicated, is called the pervasive suffering. And this pervasive suffering is said to occur just by the very fact that we're born. And one thing that Buddha always talked about is, he said, and this is part of change, he said, everything that's born has to die. So you can see that just by being born means that you're committed to the suffering of death. And more generally, what we will eventually get at a very deep level is that in some sense, we create our existence in samsara by our clinging to life. And ultimately, that's caused at a very deep level by what's called the delusion or an affliction. And the deepest delusion or affliction is called ignorance. And it's our ignorance that actually keeps us bound in samsara and will be the part of the solution to getting out of samsara, which is how we're going to get out of our suffering. But at any rate, in a certain sense, if the cause of our current existence has some negativity associated with it, then that is a cause of negativity. And so the result has to also have some negativity associated with it. And that negativity that's associated with it is this unsatisfactoriness of life. So this is a very difficult thing. And I think I can't get too deeply into it here because we need more background. We need to build up more ideas to talk about this. But anyway, it's a theme that you can sort of watch for as we're going through. And so we will come through and talk about these delusions and afflictions and how they're connected to suffering in more detail. And this part of it will actually turn out to be the most helpful thing in living a better day-to-day life, moment by moment. Some other sufferings that I will mention, which I think there were two other sufferings which Buddha directly talked about in the Pali canons, which are the recording of his life's teachings. And these are actually quite interesting also. And I think this is interesting to play with and think about it with respect to your life. Buddha said that one suffering that everybody experiences is not getting what you want. We all have situations where we don't get what we want. And the converse of that is we all run into situations where we have to encounter what we don't want. So unpleasant situations. So this is actually a very, if you want to talk about pervasive, suffering, think about these two things. Over and over again in our lives, we are going to encounter situations where we're just not going to get what we want. And over again in our lives, we're going to have to deal with unpleasant situations where we have to deal with things that we don't want to deal with. And I think that's, to me, when I first heard that, I always thought that was one of the most interesting discussions because it has a truth at such a deep level. And I think it's very helpful in understanding, that life is dealing with suffering and change. Okay, so that's the first thing. So when we're talking this way, then this is why you see why people say that Buddhism is the dismal science. Because it looks like, it's so black, we're stuck with the suffering. And even when we're having happiness, that's also suffering. It sounds absolutely dreadful, but it's not. And it's not on several levels. It's not because, as you're going to see, Buddha found an escape from all of this, a permanent escape from all of this. But actually, even in a day-to-day sense, you can actually make your life better. You can deal with these kinds of sufferings, this kind of dissatisfactoriness of life that you encounter moment by moment. One of the best things at all in Buddhism is it gives you tools and techniques for dealing with the difficulties of life. So, and it doesn't mean that bad things won't happen to you, but what it does mean is that when bad things do happen to you, you can deal with it. And the reason why this is going to be possible is, as we're going to discuss more, all of these themes are going to come back again and again. We're going to keep discussing because they have so many different angles. But ultimately, our deepest suffering is mental. Our deepest suffering is mental. It's how our mind responds to this world, which causes our deepest, worst suffering. And so if you can learn to transform your mind, to work with your mind, you can have terrible things happen to you and it won't matter. It'll be perfectly fine. You know, an example of this is what happens if your car breaks down. If your car breaks down, you know, especially if it's, you know, in rush hour traffic, well, not that we ever have any of that in Santa Fe, but some of the rest of you in California maybe know about rush hour. But at any rate, you know, I mean, when your car breaks down, if for no other reason, for me, the worst thing about my car breaking down is just the hassle of dealing with it. You know, trying to find a repairman, fixing it, the time, all the inconvenience of not having a car and so forth. But nonetheless, actually, if your car breaks down, your car has just broken down. That's neither happiness nor unhappiness. It's only you who are either happy or unhappy about it. You know, if you're living in California and your car breaks down and you're about to go across the Bay Bridge, just before a terrible earthquake happens when the Bay Bridge falls into the ocean, then you're quite happy that your car broke down. This almost happened to my brother, actually. He was in one of these big last earthquakes, and he was actually heading toward a bridge that was damaged in a big earthquake, and he stopped in time. But at any rate, but on the other hand, you know, it's like for most of us, you know, we're terribly upset when our car breaks down. You know, even if we have enough money, even if money's not an issue, but for some people, money is an issue. But even if you have enough money, it's still just the hassle of dealing with it. But why is it unhappy? It's our attitude about it. It's our unhappiness with having to deal with all of that hassle. And so anyway, we will get more into that, but it's really worth thinking about. The one major theme in Buddhism is your mind, and how your mind engages with the world around it. And in fact, yeah, one way of defining Buddhism is the practical goal of Buddhism is actually changing your mind. It's a whole set of techniques for how to change your mind. And a lot of that changing your mind is actually changing how you look at the world, how you view events as they're interacting with you, and how you think about it. And so we'll talk about that some more. Unfortunately, in this course, I won't be able to get into the real details about how you actually deal with it. I mean, there's Buddhism has tons of teachings, for example, for how to deal with anger. There's many, many techniques. If you've got anger, there's many, many techniques that are taught in Buddhism. And in Buddhism, and these are called antidotes. And in Buddhism, these things, there's usually not just one or two things that are taught. And the reason why there's not one or two things is because everybody's different. And everybody, you know, different things work for different people. So you need millions of different techniques for everything because everybody's different. So everybody has to have a way of latching on to that one thing that will actually help them. Okay, so I should probably stop talking there. Let's go to the second noble truth. So the second noble truth is the truth of the cause of suffering. So sometimes it's called true cause. So what Buddha said is suffering is not random. You know, the one thing that I emphasized very, very strongly last week was that everything in Buddhism is about cause and effect. Everything in Buddhism, what Buddha said is that everything that happens is a reason or cause for it. In fact, there's usually not just one cause. There's usually multiple causes for each thing that happens. But anyway, in the Buddhist world, it's a causal world. And if we suffer, it's just not random. You know, it's like, you know, but in fact, our suffering does, you know, for most people, I think, does appear random. You know, why did I get the flu? Why do some people get COVID and other people don't? You know, even people who are being very careful, who take lots of you know, who really are so careful, even some of those people have gotten COVID, you know, and you have some people, you have things like businesses. Some business people just seem to succeed, and it seems to almost doesn't matter what happens. They're just always successful. Other people have everything going for them and they don't succeed. And so what Buddha said is that all of this is no accident. And of course, this is going to be tied a lot into the law of karma. But the law of karma, as we're going to describe, is a lot more subtle and a lot more flexible and a much bigger world than I think most people's notion of karma than they get from our ordinary society. So karma is a big subject, but we're getting there. So, but anyway, in fact, that we're even here too, because what is the cause of our suffering? The cause of our suffering is twofold. These delusions or afflictions. I use two different words, delusion and affliction, because different people translate it both ways. The actual Sanskrit word is klesha. And of course, as we translate from one language to the other, people are always using what they think are synonyms. And delusions, and both words are actually very accurate. I'll talk about that reason why. So thinking of them as afflictions is a good way, but also thinking about them delusions also has a lot of truth to it. But anyway, these afflictions and delusions are things like anger, greed, jealousy, a lot of things like that. Again, I'm going to come and explain that in greater detail. And all of these, and of course, ignorance is the big one. And all of these things affect the actions that we do. And through the actions we do, of which the most important action is actually our mental action, the intention, what we're intending to happen. In fact, the Buddha said that that's what real karma is that intention. And the actual physical action, if there is a physical action, is just the carry through of it, if you like. But so all of these afflictions, delusions are a cause of karma. They help cause why we generate karma. And from karma, we generate all of these, good and bad things happening to us. Okay, so let me I'm going to come and talk more in detail about these afflictions, delusions, because these afflictions, delusions are actually, like I say, the heart of making your ordinary life better. So then, at this point, I think we have to talk a little bit about rebirth, because as soon as you talk about karma, it immediately gets you into rebirth. And again, I think with all of these concepts, we're going to hit them over and over again at different levels. And so since I haven't talked about rebirth before, I think it's important to at least talk a little bit about it now, because I've mentioned samsara, I've mentioned the words nirvana, but especially in samsara, this notion of rebirth, and especially when you associate it with karma, becomes critically important. As I've said before, to be a Buddhist, you don't have to believe in rebirth. You don't have to believe in karma. You don't have to believe anything. Buddhism is not about belief. It's more about how you practice your life. But nonetheless, in most forms of Buddhism, rebirth, it's common for most people to believe in rebirth. And again, for any of these notions, what they say for beginners is you shouldn't feel put upon to believe any of these things. The way Buddhism works is you focus on what seems right to you, what makes sense to you, and the things that seem a little bit odd or not quite right or you don't understand, the best thing to do is just put them to the side a little bit and just don't worry about it. Just focus on the things that do help you, the things that you like, and focus on those. And eventually what most people find is these other things will come in naturally. So there's a lot of people that begin Buddhism without believing in rebirth, or they're agnostic. Most people, I think, are probably agnostic. But you shouldn't feel obligated. You shouldn't say, well, I can't be a Buddhist unless I believe in rebirth and all of these things. You shouldn't worry about it. It doesn't really matter. So anyway, that's just something to be aware of. But in rebirth, what happens in Buddhism is Buddhism says that every sentient being is reborn over and over again forever. And in fact, Buddha said, I don't see the beginning of anybody's sequence of rebirths. People have been reborn essentially forever into the past. And I don't quite know what that means, but that is what Buddha said. And basically, this notion of rebirth will continue forever into the future, except if you attain liberation or enlightenment from samsara. So rebirth is linked to this notion of samsara. Samsara is the world that we're currently born into. But as we will discover, it also involves, the Buddha said there are other worlds that we can also be reborn into. Better realms like heavenly realms, and worse realms like hellish realms. But all of these, in fact, he talked about 6 realms, which we will get into, but all of these 6 realms are temporary. It's like, and samsara is like a revolt. Sometimes they talk about cyclic existence. And the reason they talk about cyclic existence, because rebirth is a constant cycle. It's a constant turnover. In Buddhism, you will be born in these higher realms. You will create the merit to be born in these higher realms. When you burn up that merit, you fall down to lower realms. When you burn up the negative karma that caused you to be in the lower realms, you raise up again. And you just cycle back and forth continually. And so that's why it's called cyclic existence. But in all 6 realms, there is this notion of suffering, or as I was talking, the better word is it's a dissatisfactory existence. Because even if you're in the heavenly realms, the real problem is you can't stay there. You know, it's not like the Christian heaven where you go to heaven and you're there forever. You don't stay there. Eventually, you'll have to leave it. The good news is, of course, if you go to hell, you don't have to stay in hell forever either. So there's a little bit positive and negative there. But the bad thing is that you're always stuck, you know, and when you really get this notion of being stuck, then that is really the motivating factor to say, I got to get out of this. And that's ultimately what nirvana is. Nirvana is liberation from samsara. And Buddha said it is possible to escape. And he says, I know it's possible to escape because I've done it. And if you follow the same path I do, you will also escape. If you create the causes to be liberated from samsara, you will be liberated, whether you want to or not. Okay. So I will come more to this later. So again, it's actually good to hit these things briefly and then come back and look at them in more detail, because a lot of these things can be, if you've never heard it before, sometimes it can be a little shocking. So it's good to actually sort of become a little familiar with it, get the shock over, and then hit them back in a little more detail, and with hopefully a little bit more understanding, because as I said, everything in Buddhism is about cause and effect. Nothing happens randomly. And you can understand why all of these different things, why the system works the way it does. It actually, there's a logic to the whole system, but it takes a while to get to that logic. So we have to sort of work up on it gradually, piece by piece, which is what I'm trying to do in this course. Of course, I don't have much time. I've only got 4 sessions, but I will do the best I can. But anyway, the other thing too, so we're talking about rebirth. So what is reborn? And as you know, there is this notion, you know, one of the other things that Buddha kept talking about is there is no self. But we will come back to that at a later thing. But I think for now, it's better to just think on a conventional level. And in fact, that's the way Buddha taught most of the time. He taught on a conventional level. There's a notion called skill and means, upaya, which the Buddha always used, which he always explained things to each group of people according to their capacity. So when you're in the beginning, you can't explain everything. So we have to start simply and gradually build up into a deeper understanding. But for the beginning, you know, I think all of us think we have what we think is ourself. And the most important component of ourself is actually our mind. And on a conventional level, the Buddha taught actually that there's 3 different levels of mind. There's a gross mind, which the mind of which all of us are in almost 100% of the time. That's our normal mind, where that's the mind you are in right now, is your gross mind. And then there's a subtle level of mind, and that's a mind you also experience, that you yourself experience all the time, because you go into a subtle mind when you're sleeping. So sleep is where our subtle, so when we fall asleep, the language that he used, it's useful to get used to this language. I don't know if it really means anything, but the way it's usually taught, and I think it's sort of a, you know, there are these, Buddhism uses a lot of visual images, and these images I think are helpful. So the way they usually say, they say our gross mind is absorbed into our subtle mind when we fall asleep. And, and you're aware, your sleeping mind is different than the mind that you're experiencing right now. So, so the way they talk about it is our gross mind is being absorbed into our subtle mind. Now, for most of us, during our ordinary life, those are the only two levels of mind that we ever experience, unless you're a very unusual person. But there is a third level of mind, and this third level of mind is the level of mind which is helpful for the notion of rebirth, according to some of the deeper teachings, especially tantric teachings. You really get, or Vajrayana teachings, you really get into these subtle. So you can go from gross to subtle, and the third level is very subtle. Sometimes they talk about clear light mind and so forth. When you start heading into this regime, you're heading into this notion of very subtle mind. And this very subtle mind is something that in our ordinary life we don't experience. Tantric practitioners can, if they're very skillful and have reached deep levels, can delve into this mind actually. And this gets into chakras and all sorts of esoteric things, but which we will talk a little bit about in our fourth session. But anyway, it's just useful to know that there is this very subtle mind. And where it normally occurs is at death. At death, again, using this very picturesque language, what they say is we go through the sequence. Our gross mind is absorbed into our subtle mind. Then at the moment of death, our subtle mind is absorbed into our very subtle mind. And it's this very subtle mind, which is the mind that progresses into your next life. Actually, in the Tibetan tradition, it says that you go into an intermediate state of bardo, and then sometime between immediate to 49 days, usually, you stay in this intermediate state of bardo, and then after that, sometime during that period, you are reborn into your next life, depending upon where your karma takes you. So that is the notion of rebirth. And so what follows you into your next life? Well, the thing that doesn't follow you is who you are now. Because if you think about who are you now? If you were to talk to somebody in the street and try to explain who you are, what would you do? Well, you'd talk about your history. You'd probably tell the person your biography, the important events that happened in your life, maybe important things that you believe very strongly, things like that. You have all of these things that you would talk about. None of that goes with you into your next life. What really goes into your next life is basically your karma. So when you're reborn in your next life, and let's make it easy and say that you're reborn as a human again, which actually is a very good rebirth in Buddhist terms. But let's say you're reborn as a human again. When you're reborn, you won't remember anything of this life. And what will happen? The same thing will happen in your next life that happened in this life. You'll be born into a certain family. You'll have experiences with those families. You'll have either loving or not so loving parents. You'll be born in either a poor environment or rich environment. You'll have your friends. All of these things will contribute to the person you will be in your next life. And so your personality and the person that you will grow into will be that person. And you won't remember anything of this life. And of course, a lot of that will be controlled by, karmic influences, but it will also be controlled by choices you make. It's like karma does not determine everything in your life. It also matters a huge amount, the choices that you're making moment to moment. And those two things interact in a very complicated way. In fact, the Buddha talked about like this. The Buddha met some Jains, and these Jains were beating up on themselves and going through these strong asceticisms and doing all of these things that were really hurting themselves, actually. And the Buddha asked them, and he said, why are you doing this? And they said, well, we're purifying our bad karma from our previous existence. And And that's why we're doing it. So the Buddha asked them, but when you're doing these things, does it hurt? And they said, yes, it does hurt. And the Buddha said, well, when you stop doing these things, does it stop hurting? And they say, yes, it does stop hurting. So the obvious conclusion is that it wasn't some previous karma that was causing them to hurt, is what they were doing right in the moment. So karma is not this iron fate that you normally think about. You do have real choice, and what you do matters. And in fact, as we'll talk more about when we go deeper into karma, it also, what you do now, the person you are, whether you're a good person, a bad person, makes a difference. And it affects how your karma ripens. And you can have the same karma, but depending on the type of person you are, that karma may ripen differently. And so it really does, what you are doing now makes a big difference. You know, karma is not this fate that's predetermined. Your life is not predetermined. The choices you make moment by moment make a huge difference. And they affect what karma ripens. Of course, they affect what karma you're creating now in the future. So it's really, so you should never think that what you're doing right now doesn't matter. But we will come back and talk again more deeper at this again, more deeply. Okay, so anyway, the important thing to do is just to remember that you shouldn't think about your current personality as continuing into your next life. Your next life will be determined by the experiences of that next life. And so it's a little bit different. It's not like, you know, some people say, oh, I remember being Cleopatra in a previous lifetime or something like that. That's not how karma works. It's not as though your own personal, all your feelings and thoughts and experiences continue into your next life. They won't. What will continue into your next life is your karma and the continuity of mind. So in Buddhism, they say there is a continuity of mind. There's a mental continuum is the word that they talk about. So one moment of consciousness gives rise to the next moment of consciousness, which gives rise to the next moment of consciousness. And that, in a sense, is what your self is. Your self is, in a sense, is this mental continuum. But of course, this mental continuum has no content. It's pretty much the way we are in this life. You know, in this life, we're born, you know, we're a little kid, we grow up, we grow older, we become an adult. And if you're like me, you're starting to become an old adult. And, you know, and how do we know we're the same person? It's because we're continuous all throughout this life. You know, our mind is continuous, our body is actually completely different. Actually, our mind is completely different. I mean, the mind you have now is a million times different than your mind when you were a 3-year-old. But it has evolved slowly. The changes slowly and continuously happen. So we project an identity onto this. And our body has slowly and continuously changed. And so even though the body I have now is nothing like the body I had as a 3-year-old, in fact, it'd be wonderful to have some of that flexibility. But at any rate, you know, it's so that's how we work in this world. We see continuities and we project identities onto these continuities. So that's who we think of as ourselves, is actually this continually, constantly changing thing, because it has continuously and gradually evolved. We project an identity onto it, and that's what we identify as ourself. But that self has no content. You know, that self can be anything. It just depends on how we evolved. So anyway, we'll come back to that later. So anyway, that's just a little bit on rebirth. So I think that's helpful to know, just to do it. Okay, so now we come to karma. So karma is this vast subject. And again, I can't talk about everything about karma because it is so vast. And, you know, I could spend the next 5 years talking about karma. There's so many things to talk about. But what we want to do is get the key idea. So karma is a Sanskrit word that means action. It actually comes from a root verb, kur, which means to do or to act. And karma is the noun associated with that. So it means action. But what Buddha talked about is that actually real karma is actually mental intention. So the actions that you do matter. But the most important part about any karma is what you're intending to do. And the most important thing about what you're intending to do is whether it's harmful or non-harmful or beneficial. Sometimes our actions are also neutral, because that's what's really determined. It's that intention. If we're intending to harm somebody, that's how we generate negative karma. So negative karma has to do with harming of either ourselves or others. And it's really, what matters is really that intention. It's that wish to harm people. And usually that wish to harm people has a lot to do with our egotism. You know, the reason we usually want to harm people is because we feel like they've harmed us in some way. So we're really angry and we want to lash back and get back at them. But it's that notion of harming that's really critical. And it's useful to actually see this notion of egotism brought in too, because that comes back to the deepest level of ignorance of self, no self. And it's through that sort of looking at that egotism that you begin to see why these notions of emptiness or no self are so critically important for the way out. But nonetheless, so harming is what, the wish to harm is what causes non-virtuous actions. And of course, whether you follow through with it or not matters, because if you intend to actually hit somebody, but then at the very last minute you hold back, you have still generated negative karma by that violence, that wish to harm them. But the fact that you held back makes it not quite so bad. So the negative karma you generated isn't quite so bad. Whereas if you go follow through and you actually hit the person and then are jumping up and down for joy afterwards over how much the person is hurting and how happy you are you got back at them, then you've generated even worse karma. But it really has to do most of all with mind, with that intention to harm. And the opposite of that, of course, is, which sometimes people never realize, when people talk about karma, they always think about bad things happening to them. You know, they never think about good things happening to them. But karma goes both ways. It goes good and bad. And the good karma is actually more important than the bad karma. Because for anything good to happen to you, you have to generate good karma. So even to follow a spiritual path, if you're going to be successful on that spiritual path, you have to generate good karma. Sometimes that good karma goes under the word punya, which means merit. So punya is a Sanskrit word, and it's often referred to as merit. It took me probably about 5 years of Buddhism before I equated all this merit with good karma. For a long time, I suspected that the two were the same. It took me a long time before I finally knew. But that's what it is. Merit is the same as good karma. And good karma is generated by the wish to benefit people, the wish to help people. The opposite of non-harming is how you generate good merit. And there's tons of ways you can generate good merit. These are the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, actually, that they talk about. Giving and all of these sorts of things. Generosity is a huge thing. So all of these things are really important. And if you're going to follow a spiritual path, it's actually really important. I mean, I once knew a Buddhist nun who used to fly to various Buddhist festivals around the world. And she noticed after a while that for some funny reason, she kept getting upgraded, even when she didn't really have the points or so forth to get upgraded. It just sort of spontaneously happened. She kept getting upgraded to business or first class or whatever. And she actually, now this is interesting because this really illustrates the way a Buddhist thinks and why a Buddhist thinks differently than the ordinary person. Most of us would be jumping up and down for joy if we got upgraded spontaneously to business class or first class, we'd be extremely happy. For her, she said, oh, it must be my good karma that is causing this to happen. It's because I've generated some really positive merit and I'm getting rewarded because it's ripening as these upgrades. And she said, that is terrible. So why did she think that that was terrible? The reason she thought it was terrible was because she was wasting her good karma. For her, what was really important is to use the good karma to achieve higher spiritual realizations. And you think about it on a practical level. So what? You have a little bit nicer airplane ride for a few hours, but compare that to maybe getting a realization of emptiness or some amazing realization that helps you down your spiritual path. So she actually made prayers to stop getting upgrades. And after that, she never got upgraded again, but she was really happy because her good merit was finally being put to good service by helping her advance along the spiritual path. So anyway, I think this result, when I heard this, it really astonished me. But after you think about it, you start to see how Buddhists think differently. Once you really get these notions of karma and so forth, and you understand them at a deeper level, it becomes really important. And for me, I think the transformative moment was when I started learning about merit or good karma. Because when you get this notion of, I need this good merit, I've got to generate this. And of course, the way you generate it is things like giving, helping people. You can also do spiritual practices that generate good karma. There's lots of different things. But anyway, so actually, as a spiritual practitioner, looking for ways to generate more positive karma and looking for ways to reduce your negative karmas is pretty much what the Buddhist path is about on a day-to-day level. And the good thing about this is that it makes a difference every day, because the ultimate goal is full enlightenment. And before you reach that, you reach liberation, and we'll talk about the difference between these. But on this path, but liberation and enlightenment are these vast paths, these really very high spiritual goals. But they don't happen. You don't live an ordinary life and then somebody blesses you and suddenly you're enlightened. Sometimes they talk about this in Zen, but for other Buddhists, they say, yeah, it can happen. It can look like it happens immediately. But what's really happened is, in countless lives before then, you generated all the positive karma for it to happen. And then once you've generated the positive karma, then in the next life, it's spontaneous. It can look like it happens really quickly. But in Buddhism, nothing happens out of the blue. Everything is a cause and effect. And if you are to become enlightened, you have to create those causes. And it takes time, and you have to gradually creep up on it. I think I talked last time that in the Pali Canon, one of the sutras, Buddha talked about Buddhism or the path of Dharma, like being on a sandy beach and walking into the ocean. You gradually immerse yourself deeper and deeper into the ocean. And that's the way that Buddhism really works, is that you work on it and you generate more positive karma. You learn to control your mind more. You learn to stop all of these negative actions. You get better and better at that. And your life gradually transforms and you reach higher and higher spiritual realization. And the speed at which that happens depends on the speed at which you practice. How dedicated, how serious you are about making these things happen. Again, you have to be careful not to burn out. There are people that burn out. You don't want to do that. Buddha also said you should practice gradually. Don't just suddenly start practicing day and night because you'll burn out, then you'll stop. I've seen that happen many times. But at any rate, so all of these things are continuous. And so enlightenment is like perfect, blissful happiness, as is liberation. But you can get there slowly. And the longer you practice Buddhism, the happier, the better your life will be, even irrespective of what happens to you externally. We all have lots of negative karma that can ripen, although there is something you can do about that. We'll talk about purification practices. So you can get rid of some of your negative karma, you can purify it. But nonetheless, let's say you don't purify. So things can happen to you. But like I say, For a Buddhist who's practicing at a very deep level, it doesn't matter what happens to you. You will be happy anyway. And in fact, better and better things will actually happen to you because you're going to be generating more and more positive karma and things. It's like this nun that kept getting upgrades. Actually, things will gradually get better for you as you follow along the path. But the important thing is that you can make your mind happy. So essentially, as I will again describe it more, but you can remove these delusions, afflictions, which are disturbed states of mind, which are distorted ways of thinking about the world. You can gradually, over a period of time, learn to remove these. And as I will explain, it's these delusions and afflictions which make our minds out of control. And as you get rid of these delusions and afflictions, you can actually develop more control over your mind and direct your mind more positively. And as you direct your mind more positively, moment by moment, your life is better. You are happier because your mind is happier. So anyway, we'll come back and talk about this more and more. So let me go back a little bit more into other notions of karma. The way that people usually talk about karma is they talk about karmic seeds. But these karmic seeds aren't real seeds. This is just a picturesque way of talking about things. So they say, imagine that every action that you commit, if it's you create a karmic seed, and that is somehow stored in your mental continuum. And then at some point in the future, that karmic seed will ripen. In general, it's more complicated because we're generating lots of karmic seeds constantly. And, things just don't happen by a single, you don't have a single karmic seed ripening right now. You probably got 50, 100 karmic seeds ripening right now. It's going into what's happening to your current moment. So it's more complicated but anyway, people simplify it in terms of thinking about each action being a karmic seed that will eventually ripen. And so that is the notion of karma. However, what they often don't tell you about is that karma can ripen differently. That karma can have a terrible result, or that karma can be ameliorated. It can have less of a result. And that's where your present moment of mind comes in. If you are a deeply spiritual person, these negative things don't impact you so much. And part of the reason for that is, probably the real reason for it is also that if you're leaving, first of all, there's two things that happen. One is the impact of that karma, how it affects you. But also, you have to ask yourself, I got these millions of bits of karma floating around inside me. How it works, none of us really know. In fact, the Buddha said none of us have any chance really knowing how karma works because it's too complicated. It's too convoluted. But anyway, so we've got all this karma that can ripen. What determines which karma ripens? Well, a big part of determining which part karma ripens is who you are. If you're leading a really deeply spiritual life, you're going to mainly ripen your good karma. And when that good, and so you have an influence, first of all, on which karma will mainly ripen. But you also, also, it's more complicated than that. Who you are and what you're doing affects how the karma ripens also. And how all of that works, it's too complicated, and the Buddha said. So the Buddha understood it, and the Buddha said, I can see how it works. And in fact, in the Buddha's lifetime, people would often, they would see there's some good or bad event happening to some people, some person, and they would often go to Buddha and ask, what was it that caused this event? And the Buddha would look back in their past lifetime and explain what happened to them and what caused it to happen. But for most of it, it doesn't matter. The only important thing to matter is what you're doing, the life you're living now is so important. And that's the best way to deal with your karma. First of all, because if you're leading a spiritual life, you're creating tons of positive karma for the future. And secondly, you're helping to ameliorate the impact of your negative karma. And as I've said, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are spiritual practices to various types of mantra recitation and things that you can do to actually purify your old negative karma. And I myself personally do some of these practices every day because I want to reduce my negative karma. And of course, the important thing is also generating as much positive karma as you can. So anyway, that's this notion of karmic seeds. But again, the most important thing in any action. So if you, I don't know, if you're driving your car down the highway and you run over a bug, you aren't generating negative karma because you weren't intending to do that. You had no wish to harm that bug or whatever. But if you actually try to kill an insect, then you are generating a mind of harming. And that mind of harming is the thing that is the most important thing. So again, that's the thing to hang on to for karma. And that's why Buddhists practice mindfulness, why they watch their minds. Because the idea is eventually to gain control over your mind and to stop generating these minds of harming and to generate harms of wanting to be beneficial. And the good thing about doing this is it makes you feel better, is it has an immediate effect. When you have thoughts of harming, you're in a negative space. You're in this unhappy, it's a really unhappy mind. It's a painful mind. It's not a place you want to be. And when you are, you can practice this in your own life. When you are in a generous state of mind, it makes you feel happy. It makes you feel better. One simple practice that I've done a lot, and there's this sort of acts of loving kindness, which actually in the Theravadan tradition, some of the monks there highly push that. And Buddha himself actually talked about it. But actually, you can generate a mind of lovingness toward another person that makes you happy. So one way you can do that is imagine yourself driving down the road. And when you're driving down the road, just look at the person driving the car in front of you and just make the wish. Say, I wish that you could be happy. May you be happy. And you look at maybe the person driving next to you. You do the same thing. I wish for you to be happy. And you try to be really genuine about that. Just wish for that person to be happy. And where it really comes in very powerfully is if somebody maybe cuts in front of you or, blocks your path or is obstructing you or driving horribly. Instead of yelling at them or getting mad at them, just generate this wish. May you be happy. I'm happy that you've gotten ahead of me, that you're going to get to wherever you want first. Just start generating this way of thinking and just observe what happens to your mind. And what you will observe happen to your mind is you will start getting happy. You can do this in a grocery store too. You can look at the clerk. May you be happy. You can look at to the person in front of you. You just generate this wish. May you be happy. And it's a fun thing to play with. And it actually transforms your life in an instant. If you're in a bad mood, this is the best thing you can do. It will change your bad mood into a good mood very, very quickly. It's an amazing thing. That, and the wish to be happy, for someone to be happy is a way of loving. It's a notion of loving kindness. And Buddha actually said that the way to generate almost infinite amounts of merit is actually just lay in your bed and start wishing for everybody in the whole world to be happy. And usually the best way is you start off with your immediate family, then you spread your relatives to your city, state, country, and then the whole world. But if you can actually try to genuate this genuine wish, just sit there and think, may everybody be happy. And just dwell on that and try to feel it very deeply. And then watch what happens to your mind. And the Buddha said that this is one of the ways to generate, huge amounts of merit. Because one way is sort of a multiplier effect. Each person that you're thinking of, that wish for each of them to be happy generates merit. So the more people you want to be happy, the more merit you generate. So anyway, it's something, in Buddhism, you have to play with these things, you got to try thsee things out and just watch your mind, see how it reacts. And what you will discover, the main reason is to be virtuous, which means wish to be beneficial. And the main reason not to be non-virtuous, which is the wish to get rid of wishes to harm, is because it makes you happy. And it makes your immediate life happy now, in the moment. You don't have to wait to be enlightened. And so what happens is as you live your life, as you gain control over the negativities in your mind, you can transform your mind so it is happy all the time. And that's an immediate goal. You don't have to wait for enlightenment or liberation. It's like an immediate positive thing that you can practice. But again, I suggest playing with these things, seeing if it's really true, seeing if these, the same way of generosity. Sometimes when people are very generous, it makes you really happy to be generous. Again, sometimes people are generous because they just want to look good. So that's a different thing. But if you're generous because you actually care about the person and you want that person to be happy and you want to help them out by giving them something, it really it makes you feel very good. It's like mothers feel really good when they're happy helping their children. It feels wonderful for a mother when they're helping their children. Granted, there's some egotism, some sort of self-love in there also, but nonetheless, moments of generosity, if they're genuine, they make you very happy. Okay, so let me stop here for a 5-minute break because it's 2 hours is too long. So I will stop. Is a 5-minute break long enough, or do people want 10-minute breaks? Any thoughts? Are you going to say something, Kim? Sheila. Okay. So if there's no objection, I'll make it a 5-minute because it's hard to get through all this material. So I'll set a timer for 5 minutes, and then I'll sign off now and come back in 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm back again now. I'll give you a minute or so to catch up. Maybe I'll have to give a little bit longer break. I think 5 minutes. I have a lot of material to cover, so maybe I'm trying to push too fast. So let me ask, are there any questions about all of this? I mean, I think I've thrown on, the hard thing is I'm trying to do all of Buddhism in 4 weeks, so I feel like I'm throwing so much material at all of you so quickly. But I'm trying to make it at least coherent and fit together, I hope. And a lot of this stuff I will keep sort of repeating as we go through. But these 4 Noble Truths in particular are sort of the cornerstone, I think, because they explain a lot about samsara, nirvana, karma, all of these sort of fundamental aspects that carry through all the rest of Buddhism. But let me just ask, are there any questions? Does anybody have any? Yeah, TH, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Bob. This is really, really good. I love how you structure the material. It makes sense. So, and it's very clear the way you explain things. So I really appreciate it. I have a question on when you said intention, I think Rubina said this too, intention is the boss, right? If we're looking for the boss, it's intention is the boss.
Yes.
How does that fit into the hierarchy of the minds? Is that only controlled at the gross mind level, or can we control the subtle mind? Where does intention live?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think it really lives in the gross mind. Because when you're dreaming, it's said that you don't generate positive or karma. and when you're in the actually the very highest mind, the very subtle mind, actually there's no thinking involved. You've gone to such a subtle thinking is considered to be a gross mind. And in fact, thinking is associated with all our delusions and afflictions. And so actually for a tantric practitioner, this very subtle mind is the most powerful mind of all because it's completely undistracted. It has no negativity in it at all. And for a tantric practitioner, your goal is actually to use that mind to meditate on emptiness, because that's when you have such an intense mind, you can have a breakthrough. So I would say that, yeah, I mean it's your gross mind where all of this other stuff lives. Is that helpful? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Um, is there any other questions or? Yeah, I think for most of us, most of the path that we work on as ordinary Buddhists is really our gross mind. So, I mean, I introduced these notions of subtle mind and very subtle mind because they do start to play in, especially it's mainly in tantric or vajrayana practice where they start to become really important. Because it's only when you get to that level of practice that you can start to go more. And people also can use their sleeping mind also for spiritual practice. In fact, Lama Yeshe was said to have done that, one of the people who started the FPMT, or particular head of our organization. But anyway, it's so it is possible to use these things, but for most of us ordinary people, we mainly function on the gross level mind, and that's actually quite enough. That can take you a long way. Okay.
Bob?
Yes, Barbara.
I have a question.
Sure.
I guess I was under the understanding that, intention is I will do whatever, but it's really the motivation of what you are doing that determines whether it's virtuous or non-virtuous. Is that correct? Do I have that down right?
Yeah.
I think motivation more than the intention.
Yeah, it's basically, it's well, they sort of go together because but I sort of agree with you. Yeah, I mean, it's that strong, for example, it's that strong wish to harm. When you're really angry at some people, sometimes you want to lash back, and sometimes you get this notion, oh, I wish I could kill that person even. In this talk on the civil rights movement, people were saying, oh, I wish I could blow up this building, or, it's like people can get very angry when they're harmed. But it is sort of the motivation and intention. Yeah, it's that strong, well, it's really that strong wish to harm. It's that desire to harm. It's saying, yes, I do want to harm. Or it's saying, yes, I do want to help this person. It's that part of mind, whether you want to call it motivation or intention. It's that sort of that strong desire, or that strong, I want to do this or I don't want to do this. So it's sort of, maybe it actually is more intention than motivation. Motivation, we think of reasons for why, so for example, maybe you start thinking about how a person was yelling at you or somebody hit you, and then you start getting angry and angry, and then suddenly you decide, yes, I'm going to get this person back. I'm going to hit them or shoot them or something like that. So maybe it goes beyond motivation. I think intention probably is a better word for it. But motivation is sort of, I think, the step that leads you, it's all that thinking about things that leads you to actually develop that intention. Actually, a lot of the motivation is what we call the delusions or afflictions. It's all of that, because it's really things like anger and things like that, which are all part of the motivation. So it's, and anger and all of those sorts of things are the things that are sort of the motivating force, and they drive you to actually develop the wish to harm or benefit people. So I would say, yeah, so I would think of the motivation more as the afflictions or illusions, and the actual intention is actually sort of this this decision, if you like. Yes, I am going to definitely try to harm that person. And then, like I say, I mean, once you make that decision, I really want to harm this person, at that moment, you've generated negative karma, whether you carry it out or not. Just that mental thought, that decision, yes, I'm going to harm this person, generates that negative karma. But if you can then at that point stop yourself, it's better, because then the amount of negative karma you generate isn't as bad as if you actually do carry it out. and deeper teachings on karma, which I can't go with. They talk about different levels of karma and how complete a karma is, and all the different components that make karma complete or incomplete, which means make it worse or better, or not so bad. So anyway, yeah. So it's a little bit tricky, but it's really that. I think intention probably is a better word, but probably motivation is probably more closely associated with delusion. Okay.
Thank you.
So then, just very briefly, I should go a little bit faster so I think these, it's good to spend time with these Four Noble Truths, because I think if you really get these Four Noble Truths, it gives you such a solid foundation in Buddhism for everything else. So the 10 non-virtuous actions are sort of the obvious things you can think of. You think about, how can I harm somebody? And so you can harm people with your body by killing, stealing, or sexual misconduct. And you can harm people with speech by lying to them, device of speech, breaking up couples by talking, setting them apart. Hurtful speech, where you're directly trying to hurt somebody with what you're saying. The last one, idle chatter, is a little bit hard to explain. I think it has something to do with, if we're just sort of sitting around gossiping, our mind tends to go negative and tends to switch very quickly into harmful speech. But that's always, but the Buddha did actually talk about sort of idle chatter as being a negative state of mind. But anyway, and then the non-virtuous aspects of mind are covetousness, malice, and holding wrong views. So I'm not going to have time to go into each of these, but basically the rule of thumb is that if you're harming somebody, it's non-virtuous. If you're helping or being beneficial, it is positive. You can also generate neutral karma, which is neither harming nor whatever. And that neutral karma usually is slightly negative, because there's always some ignorance involved with it, which is a delusion. So it has some negativity, but it's basically sort of neutral. And probably a lot of the things we do are probably neutral for an ordinary person. So then the key thing is what causes us to generate this karma? So what is the driving force? And that's where we get to these afflictions and delusions. So these are important for generating negative karma. And what are these things? So basically, they are negative or disturbed states of mind. That's the first thing. So if your mind is really negative, or you're suffering terrible anxieties, or it's just sort of all disturbed, probably you're under the control of some delusion. And what are these delusions? The three principal delusions are ignorance, attachment, and anger. So ignorance is the ignorance. It doesn't mean being stupid. It means ignorance of the way reality really is. So this is these notions of emptiness and so forth that we teach at the deepest level of Buddhism. So that requires more explanation. But because of this notions of ignorance, as we do these deeper things, you'll see this notion that we have a permanent self is sort of what gives rise to these other things. Because we have a permanent self, we want to get things for it. So that leads to attachment, and attachment, wishing to get things for us, leads to stealing, all the terrible things we do to acquire wealth. And, so it leads to all of the negativities associated with greed and acquisitiveness and stealing. All of these sorts of things come from the wish to, we think something will make us happy and we can't live without it, so we will do anything. We will even harm other people in order to grab these things. So that's what the attachment is all about. So that's a delusion, and it's, it doesn't mean, you can desire good things for good reasons, but attachment really has to do with this thing of where you really get stuck on it. I just absolutely got to have this, or where you really covet things really strongly. So that's what attachment has to do with. So it has to have to do with being attracted to things that we think will bring us pleasure, is what attachment really has to do with. So anger is the opposite of that. So anger is sort of the root thing, but it has to do with pushing away all of the things we don't like. So anger, in one sense, we get angry at somebody because we're, in a sense, pushing them away. We don't like them. They've done bad things to us. We're mad at them. We try to push them away, and then sort of all the things of sort of pushing things away get swept up in anger. All of these other things like malice or lying to people or divisive speech, where all of the we can do it with our speech, with our body, with our mind. So anyway, all of these things are the delusions. And basically it's said that these delusions, because in the past we have done these actions so many times, it's like we're primed to do it. It's sometimes they talk about a latent seed of these delusions, so to speak. So it's ready. So whenever the conditions are right, anger will spring up. And basically, since we've lived millions of lifetimes before, we've done every terrible thing you can think of. We're primed to do anything negative. So when the right conditions happen, usually these delusions lead to negative karmic actions. And these sort of latencies for anger arise whenever we meet with the right conditions. So what would be a right condition for anger to generate? Well, it'd be something like if somebody yells at you, that usually makes people angry. And if you look at yourself, that anger sort of pops up spontaneously, extremely quickly. Or, if somebody has been really nice to you in the past, it's very natural for you to generate minds of loving kindness toward them and so forth. So all of these things sort of spring up very quickly. So in Buddhism, they talk about the primary delusion is ignorance. And then if you expand that, it goes into adding attachment, anger. And sometimes they expand it to 6 root delusions, where they add pride, afflicted doubt, and afflicted view. And these afflicted views are views that sort of work against the spiritual life, in a sense, that prevent you from generating a spiritual life. And then offshooting from that is everything else you can think of. They talk about 20 secondary afflictions, which are belligerence, resentment, spite, jealousy, miserliness, deceit, harmfulness, laziness, etc. In general, though, I think one way of looking at these things, so I think, so these are examples, so it sort of gives you the idea, but what is the real nature of these things? I think that's important to get, because I think if you get the real understanding of the nature of these things, it really helps a lot. One of the things I mentioned is that we call it afflictions. They're called afflictions because they afflict the mind. They make our mind disturbed, unhappy. And so it's like they're afflicting us. They're you don't want these afflictions. So that's one reason for calling them afflictions. So getting this notion of, to be happy, you need a calm, peaceful mind. You don't want a disturbed mind. And afflictions cause this disturbed mind. They afflict our mind. They destroy our peacefulness, happiness of mind, and instead give us this disturbed, negative type of mind. So that's why they're afflictions. So the other way that this word klesha is often translated is delusion. So then you can ask yourself, well, why are they called delusions? And the reason why they're called delusions is because they are actually distorted ways of thinking about the world. So, and the other notion that's heavily involved with this distortion is usually delusions or afflictions involve some kind of exaggeration of mind. And that's why there are delusions. They're not an accurate way of looking at the world. So for an example, so again, I think it helps to have an example to understand what I'm saying, because it probably doesn't make any sense to you now. But for example, let's say that there's somebody who runs around insulting you all the time. So when that person, every time you meet him, he's constantly saying derogatory things about you or whatever. When you meet with that person, or you even think about that person, anger is likely to arise. And what happens when you're angry? When you're angry, your mind starts thinking about that person, and you start thinking about how terrible that person is. You think about every instance that they insulted you, and you build up this exaggerated picture of that person as an evil being. That's what we do. We exaggerate every negative aspect that we can think of that person, and we forget anything good. We forget that maybe that person is, I don't know, a loving parent, is nice to everybody but us. We just focus on the negative aspects. And that's where you get this distortion and also this exaggeration. We exaggerate all, and we blow up all the negative things, because we feel that sense of harm to us. The thing that they did to us, we blow it up to be 10 times worse than it really is. And so that's why, that's how you get to these notions of distorted ways of thinking. And especially this exaggeration is really important. And that's actually the one of the purposes of this sort of Vipassana or insight meditation, is it sometimes helps you to clear away some of those exaggerations and to actually see that, oh, what the person said to me really wasn't that bad. Or oftentimes we attribute terrible motivations for the other person. We think, oh, that person just hates me, he's trying to be harmful. Whereas maybe in reality, the other person had something bad happen to them and they were just in a bad mood and they just lashed out at us, but there was nothing personal about it at all. So anyway, thinking about whenever you're angry or whenever you have these disturbed states of mind, look to see if there's any exaggeration involved. Look to see if you're looking at the situation in a balanced way. And the other thing is this notion of ego. And that has this notions of self, no self, on Atman and so forth in Buddhism. Because most of the time, almost all of these afflictions or delusions circle around a strong ego. It's like we especially get angry if somebody hurts us. If we see somebody yelling at somebody else, we may think, oh, that's terrible. I feel sorry for that person. But it doesn't affect us the same way as when they're yelling at us. When they're yelling at us, that sense of hurt really goes deep. And so almost all of the negative things, all of these illusions, and it's the same way with even the grasping or attachment toward things. Why do we want something so much? It's because it's going to bring us pleasure. So it's not just that this dessert, this piece of cake is delicious. It's like, I want it because I want that sense of pleasure. So there is almost always some sense of ego that gets involved in this. And that's why getting rid of this root delusion of no self really hits at getting rid of that sort of egocentric point of view. So I don't have time to go deeply into that, but it's just useful to be aware of that, to think about that a little bit, and to notice it in your own life. Whenever your mind is disturbed, let's say you're worrying about something. If you're worrying about something, it almost always involves, myself. I'm worried because I think something's going bad for me. So there is, and if you didn't have that sense of so focused on yourself, the worry wouldn't be that strong. So it's really helpful to actually look at these things. And that's why, it's like changing your point of view can actually be so helpful. because if you can get your mind into a more neutral mind and say, if something happens to you, instead of saying, oh, they did this to me, instead of really focusing on this me, it happened to me. That's the thing that really makes you angry. If you could just say, oh, I got hit, but don't focus so much on the me part, you will notice that your anger won't be as strong. So if you can get to a more neutral, objective way of looking at the world, it's actually very helpful for controlling these delusions and afflictions. And again, because when you focus on me, that's when we really exaggerate things, either positive or negative. So again, it's something that's very useful to play around with. And the other aspect in Buddhism is a lot of Buddhism is actually antidotes for all these delusions. So there's many teachings. So Buddhism lays out in many teachings, it lays out all of these different delusions, and it gives antidotes for these different things. For example, one antidote for anger is a mind of loving kindness. Like I was saying earlier, if you can switch your mind and think, when somebody you meet you don't like, if you can turn your mind around and think, may this person be happy, see what happens to your anger or your negativity toward that person. So love or loving kindness is actually an antidote for anger. And likewise for all of these delusions. And there's not just one antidote, there's millions of antidotes. And it's because, for some people to say, yeah, good luck, I'm not going to develop a mind wishing that person to be happy. It's too far to go. So you need another antidote. So then you need another technique or tool to use in your toolbox. So that's the way that Buddhism works. So it's very useful to be aware of these antidotes and things. Okay, so that's probably as much as I can talk about here. But these sort of notions of delusions and antidotes and stuff are the most useful part of Buddhism, I think, in your ordinary day-to-day life, because it's all of these delusions and afflictions that make you unhappy. And if you want to be happy, you need to learn how to control them. And you can't, and there are ways you actually can control them. You can't, a lot of these delusions and afflictions are actually, one way to think about them is they're bad habits of mind. So like any habit, you can't turn it off, on the spur of the moment. You have to work at it. You have to chip away at it. And that's why people do meditations and other things to, but you can. Usually the way you work on these things is you work first on diminishing them. So if you have a lot of spontaneous anger in your life, you work at trying to reduce the number of times when you spontaneously get angry. And you try to reduce the severity of the anger. And you do this by, again, these different meditations, applying these various antidotes and working at it. And over a period of time, you can eventually, it's like any habit, you can get rid of any habit if you work hard enough at it and sort of turn your mind around. But the big thing in helping is actually looking at the situation from a different point of view, not letting your mind get a cycle of distortion, exaggeration, and all of this sort of thing. So anyway, I can't go anymore, otherwise I'll never finish the course. but it's a very useful thing. So what is the third noble truth? The third noble truth is true cessation, the cessation of suffering. It is possible to stop suffering. And in the medical analogy, so I forgot to do the medical analogy for the last one, the cause of suffering. So the suffering would be like your illness. The Buddha would be like your doctor. The cause of suffering would be, I don't know, maybe a bacteria or a virus or whatever it is that you have is the cause of your illness. So here we're going to talk about the truth of cessation. What Buddha said is it's possible to be cured. So in the modern world, with our current state of medicine, maybe we can't cure everything. But for suffering, Buddha said, yes, you can cure this, and you can cure this completely. And as I was talking about before, you can cure it even partially. It's like even for a lot of medical things, a lot of times we can cause the you know, we can partially cure a disease, but we can also, but what Buddha said, he said that we can actually completely cure our disease. And then, of course, the final thing is going to be the fourth one is going to be the remedy, which is, you know, how do you cure it? And that's going to be the path. So it is possible for us to cure this illness, and this is the truth of cessation. And let's see, I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm not going to go through these different stages of samsara now. But basically, as I was saying before, we're stuck in samsara. And so basically the truth of cessation is that you can be liberated from samsara. And that liberation from samsara is called liberation. In the original, at the time of Buddha, it was also called nirvana, which is sort of a blowing out. And it's sort of a blowing out because in some sense, at a very deep level, it's our attachment to samsara, which keeps us stuck in samsara. And that attachment to samsara has a lot to do with this sort of egocentric notions of self and so forth, which is destroyed when you reach these deeper teachings on emptiness. So essentially, liberation is sometimes called the small nirvana, because even at the time of Buddha, they recognized that Buddha was different from the other people that were being liberated. So at the time of Buddha, these other beings who achieved liberation from samsara in the Pali language, which the Pali Canon is written as, which is like a sort of simplified Sanskrit, which is a local dialect. People were called arahants. In Sanskrit, that's called arhat. So in our tradition, we usually use the Sanskrit, so that's an arhat. An arhat is this person who has achieved this small nirvana, liberation from samsara. But to become a full Buddha, there is some very subtle defilements that still exist. So essentially, to become liberated from samsara, you remove all the negativities in your mind. All of these afflictions or delusions, you remove all of them. And you also remove what they call the seed or the latencies of these delusions or afflictions. You completely eradicate them, like, uprooting things, ripping them out by the root. And once you remove these latencies or these tendencies toward the afflictions or delusions, they never arise again. So if you completely destroy the tendency for anger, no matter what circumstances arise, anger will never arise again. And you can systematically do this for all of your delusions or afflictions. And when you do that, then you will never generate negative karma again, because you will have no negativity left in your mind at all. And when you've done this completely, that's when you achieve liberation from samsara. And the way you do this at the highest level is totally uprooting. So at the lower levels, what we do is we diminish all of these tendencies toward the afflictions of illusion. But at the highest level, what we do is by meditating these deep equipoise meditations, very profound, deep, on emptiness, we actually systematically go through and remove, uproot each of our delusions at deeper and deeper levels until finally we uproot the root of it all, which is the illusion of not knowing or not understanding, this notion of non-self. So then when we do that, then we achieve liberation from samsara. At that moment, we become liberated from samsara. If you do that during your ordinary human lifetime, you will continue to live out the rest of your life. But when you live out at the end of your life, when you die, at that moment, you will never again be reborn in samsara, because Because when we uproot this notion of ignorance, especially, we destroy all of the attachment that causes us to be reborn in samsara. And if there's no cause to be reborn in samsara, we won't be reborn in samsara. And at that moment, you achieve sort of eternal happiness. You're in the state of samsara, total bliss. And we can sort of see, even as a human being, we can sort of see some of this bliss, because in very deep meditations, you can get whiffs at how blissful the mind can be when it reaches deep spiritual states. And this liberation goes beyond that. But at that point, we've removed all of the gross obstructions or negativities. But they say that what's left over is sort of like, if you imagine a box, you put garlic in it, you close it up for a while, and then you take all the garlic out. Taking all the garlic out is like removing all of the negative afflictions, but there's still this whiff of garlic left in the box. And that's what they say is these sort of latent negativities. They're not real negativities, but sort of hints of negativity. But nonetheless, these are the things that you have to overcome to achieve full enlightenment, to full Buddhahood. And when you achieve full Buddhahood, then you achieve full omniscience. And you're at a hugely different state than the arhats. And at the time of Buddha, there were many people who did become arhats. And at the time when Buddha was alive, that's what he encouraged everybody to achieve, was this personal liberation from samsara, and to become an arhat. But people even then could see that there was a difference between the powers that Buddha had and the powers that these arhats had. Buddha just knew more. Buddha knew why everybody, how karma worked, everything else. Buddha was just at a different level. So anyway, in our tradition, the goal is actually to go beyond liberation, to go to full enlightenment. And that's when you go from the Hinayana path to the Mahayana path. And to do that, you need the notion of bodhicitta, which we will spend a lot of time working on, what bodhicitta is. So anyway, that's how it works. And you can say, well, why is this possible? The reason that this is possible is because I talked about this notion of change. Nothing is permanent. Everything is impermanent. And in particular, all the negativities of our mind were caused by causes and conditions, and they can be removed if you apply the right antidotes, the right causes and conditions. So all of these negativities of mind are not, there's nothing inherent. We are not inherently negative in any way. It's just that we happen to have done negative things in the past, and we acquired this negative karma and these negative delusions and so forth. But they can be removed. So what has been put there can be removed. Sometimes they say it's adventitious or accidental. It doesn't have to be there. It's not that. Sometimes they say that the real state of our mind has a natural purity, that we have a naturally pure mind, and it's all of these negativities of negative karma and delusions that have sort of muddied up the water. And so so they talk about achieving liberation and enlightenment as sort of cleaning out all of these things and getting rid of them. So these are different, again, picturesque ways of talking about it. But it's no doubt, the Buddha was the Buddha. He achieved enlightenment, and he said, and that's the fourth noble truth, is that there's a path to the cessation of suffering. And the Buddha said, this is the path that I followed, and you can follow it also. And so this is like taking the medicine that cures the disease. And so the Buddha taught, this is what the notion of Dharma. So the notion of Dharma is basically this notion of Buddha's teachings. And Buddha's teachings are mainly the path. It's mainly, how do you go about purifying your mind, getting rid of all of these negativities? And basically it's about, how do you become happy, is in one way of looking at it. And the Buddha taught, sometimes they say he taught 84,000 different teachings of how to do this. I don't know where they get the 84,000, but it's always passed down. It's this wonderful number. 84,000, that's what they always say. But at any rate, but it is true, the Buddha taught tons of different methods for how to accomplish this. And you do this at different levels. You can do this from mindfulness, watching your mind, learning to apply, and then learning the antidotes, learning how to apply the antidotes. Meditation is a huge thing. The Buddha always stressed meditation, because a meditation is a way of getting directly at your mind. It directly goes after your mind. That's a huge way of doing it. And then, of course, you try to reduce your negativities. You try to stop generating negative karma. You try to start creating more and more positive merit or karma. There's two general methods called compassion and wisdom that help you. Compassion has to do with things like loving kindness and things like that. And the wisdom has to do with these deep understandings of emptiness, or the way the world really is. And both of these, everything in Buddhism works together. So in Buddhism, there's not this thing where you have some initial practices you do, and then when you're done with that, you throw them away and you go on to higher practices. You continue to practice everything along the whole path. Every aspect of Buddhism reinforces other aspects. So at a lower level, we go for things like renunciation, which I'll explain next week. But renunciation helps your bodhicitta, which is a higher level thing. Your bodhicitta helps your renunciation. And all of these things help you dampen out these delusions or negativities. So everything in Buddhism works together, and you never throw away anything. So Buddhism is all reinforcing. And then the final thing, which I will mention, and meditation is actually so important, because there's this notion of control of our mind. So these delusions or afflictions are like bad habits of mind, and bad habits control us. It's the way habits always do. With a bad habit, you just spontaneously act a certain way. And so a lot of times Buddhists say we have no control over our life. What they're really talking about is the afflictions or delusions, these bad habits of mind, are most of the time controlling us. Why do you suddenly spontaneously flare up in anger? You do it without even thinking. It's because it's a bad habit of mind you created. So the best way of gaining control over this, you practice mindfulness and try to apply these antidotes. But meditation is actually a very powerful way of actually regaining control over your mind and being able to actually directly attack these delusions or afflictions. But unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that. That's for a course in meditation. The final thing is I just mentioned, so we've run out of time. I don't like to run over, because this class, especially yous that are further time zone, I don't want to be too late. So the other thing we're going to talk about in the next classes are Lam Rim, or stages of the path. And this is actually a complete path to enlightenment, starting at the very early beginnings and carrying all the way to the most advanced states of Buddhahood. So it sort of teaches you all of the different spiritual realizations and steps you need to go all the way from the beginning, all the way to the end. And it's a way of organizing all of the teachings. And of course, as we go through this, you will see all of these Four Noble Truths being used in different ways. But this will sort of go through the practical techniques of how you follow this spiritual path, what spiritual realizations are important and why they're important, and how it all sort of works together. So the next two classes are really going to be focused even, I think, more directly on on more specific things. So I've been sort of very general in my comments so far. I've tried to give enough detail so you can understand it. But anyway, that's where we're heading. So let me see if there's any questions. Again, I probably have overwhelmed you. There's just so much that, the Buddha's past is so vast, but I try to keep it at a high level, but I sort of feel like if I don't bring examples or some of the lower level things in, that you won't understand the more abstract issues. So I'm sort of torn. I keep trying to, I'm probably speaking too fast and so forth. But anyway, if there's any questions, and you can also, if you have questions, you can always write them down. And at the beginning of the next week's class, we can answer some questions if they occur to you between now and then. So So if there's no more questions, I'll let you go. I hate to keep people too long, especially you people in Wisconsin. It's probably, is it one time zone, or maybe it's probably just one time zone, yeah, away. So it's not too bad, but anyway, okay. So I will let you go for till next week, and I hope you have a good week. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you got something out of it. I hope I didn't overwhelm you too much.